Florence, Italy, a city known for Renaissance beauty, rolling vineyards, and timeless romance. But beneath the cobblestones and centuries-old villas, there lies a darkness, one that stretched across 2 decades, shattered dozens of lives, and remains unresolved to this day. The Italians call him Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. He is believed to be responsible for at least 8 double homicides between 1968 and 1985. 16 victims, all of them couples, all of them attacked while parked in isolated countryside locations. Moments of intimacy turned into brutal ritualistic executions. Some were shot, some were mutilated, and every clue led only to more confusion. To this day, no one has been convicted for all of the monster's crimes. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize this isn't just the story of a killer. It's the story of a city haunted by fear, a police force torn apart by scandal, and a justice system that fell under the weight of its own obsession. It all began on a quiet night in 1968. A young couple, Antonio Lo Bianco and Barbara Locci, parked their car in a lover's lane just outside the town of Signa, near Florence. What happened next was brutal. Both were shot multiple times. Antonio died instantly. Barbara, the mother of a young son, was also killed. But the detail that stunned investigators was who discovered the bodies: her own 6-year-old son, Natalino, who had wandered from the crime scene and rang the doorbell of a nearby house, dazed and confused. At the time, authorities arrested Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele. He confessed, claimed he was jealous, claimed she was unfaithful, claimed he acted in rage. The case was considered closed, but the real nightmare hadn't even begun. For 6 years, nothing happened. Florence was quiet again. People moved on. Until 1974. Another couple. Another lover's lane. This time, Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini. They were teenagers. He was 19, she was 18. They were parked near a forest path when the killer struck, shot, stabbed. Stefania was mutilated with shocking precision. Her body was posed, violated, displayed. The weapon, a .22 caliber Beretta pistol, matched the ballistics from the 1968 murders. Suddenly, Stefano Mele's confession looked suspicious, and a pattern had begun to emerge. By 1981, Florence was no longer sleeping peacefully. A new series of murders terrorized the countryside. It was no longer an anomaly. It was a spree. And whoever the monster was, he had a signature: young couples, isolated locations, the same weapons, similar mutilations, and a level of planning that suggested intelligence, patience, and ritual. The victims were always ambushed in their cars. The man was typically killed first, then the woman. But with each new murder, the violence escalated. In several cases, the monster removed intimate body parts, trophies perhaps, or symbols of deeper psychological compulsion. The public was horrified. Parents forbade their children from going out after dark. Lovers no longer parked on country roads. Police checkpoints dotted the rural landscapes. The media, both national and international, descended on Florence, and so did the mistakes. The investigation was massive. Hundreds of officers, dozens of theories, thousands of interviews. But for all their efforts, the authorities seemed to fall into a cycle: suspect, arrest, release. Theories rose and fell like tides, and with each mistake, the monster struck again. By 1984, the media circus had grown deafening. In July of that year, the monster killed yet another couple, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Rontini. Shot, stabbed, and mutilated with a familiarity that chilled investigators to the bone. This time, though, there was a witness. A man heard something. A scream. A gunshot. He glimpsed a shadowy figure fleeing the scene. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reignite hope. The police, desperate, looked to their old files and returned once again to the 1968 murders. That's when things got complicated. The gun used in the 1980s was the same as the one from the 1968 crime. But if Stefano Mele was imprisoned during the later murders, as he was then, who had the gun? Investigators discovered that the Beretta .22 used in the murders was never recovered. That opened a terrifying possibility: the killer had been active since 1968 and was still using the same weapon. That meant Mele may have been innocent, or worse, he was involved in something far bigger. Soon, attention turned to Mele's friends, particularly a man named Francesco Vinci. Vinci had a criminal record, a reputation for violence, and a prior relationship with Barbara Locci, the first female victim. He became a prime suspect, but there was no physical evidence. He was arrested anyway. And while Vinci sat in jail, the monster struck again. September 1983. Two German tourists, Wilfried Hentz and Jens Rusch, were found dead in their Volkswagen camper. The police had no answers, no suspects, no credibility left. The case was unraveling, and the Monster of Florence, whoever he was, seemed to know it. He wasn't just a killer. He was a phantom, a ghost moving through the olive groves and vineyards, evading the law, mocking the public. He wasn't fast. He was patient. He stalked. He selected. He killed. And then he disappeared. Florence was paralyzed by fear, and for every murder that passed, a disturbing question grew louder. Was the monster acting alone? By the mid-1980s, the Monster of Florence wasn't just a name whispered in rural villages. He was now a living nightmare sewn into the soul of Italy, a phantom hiding behind every hedgerow, every winding path, every parked car under moonlight. And yet, for all the terror he inspired, the most frightening part was that he remained invisible, but not forgotten. The police had a pattern, a clear modus operandi. 8 double homicides, all committed with the same .22 Beretta pistol and the same brand of Winchester bullets. All occurred in remote areas. All involved couples. And in nearly every case after 1981, the female victim was mutilated with disturbing surgical precision. But knowing how a killer works doesn't reveal who he is. So the authorities returned to their earliest suspect, Francesco Vinci. A Sardinian known for his violence and womanizing, Vinci had been linked to Barbara Locci, the female victim in the 1968 murders. He was also connected through family and friendship to Stefano Mele, who had originally confessed to that first double homicide. It all made sense on paper, but there was a problem. While Vinci sat in prison in 1983, the monster struck again. The alibi was irrefutable. Vinci was released. The case fell apart. This cycle of suspect arrest-release became all too common. Authorities became obsessed with a theory they called the Sardinian Trail. According to this theory, the killings were somehow tied to a vendetta, a blood feud involving Sardinian immigrants, sexual jealousy, and perhaps even a long-running conspiracy dating back to the 1960s. They arrested Vinci again. They arrested his brother. They arrested his cousin. Each time the evidence was circumstantial. Each time the monster kept killing. And with every misstep, public confidence collapsed. Florence's citizens were no longer just scared. They were furious. Why couldn't the police stop this killer? Why were innocent people being dragged into the spotlight while the real murderer roamed free? Had the investigation itself become corrupted? Behind closed doors, some investigators began to wonder, what if the monster wasn't acting alone? The mutilations had always been specific, targeted, almost ritualistic. The female victims had their sexual organs removed with precision. No blood left behind, no signs of panic. Whoever was doing this wasn't just killing, he was harvesting. And that's when an even darker theory emerged. A theory that the monster was part of a group, a secret society, a cult. To understand this theory, we have to examine the final known murders, September 7th, 1985. The victims were Jean-Michel Cravechvili and Nadine Moriot, a French couple camping in the countryside near San Casciano, not far from Florence. Their deaths were like the others, ambushed in their car shop, mutilated. But this time there was something different. The monster didn't flee immediately, he lingered. Jean-Michel, despite being shot, managed to escape the vehicle and run for over 30 meters. He was chased down and stabbed to death, suggesting either a change in the killer's behavior or a second assailant. This murder was bolder, riskier, almost theatrical. And when authorities searched the scene, they found no shell casings, no footprints, no tire marks. It was too clean. Suspicion began to shift from lone madman to organized ritual. Some detectives believed that the female organs removed from the victims were being kept as trophies. Others, more alarmingly, believed they were being delivered to someone else. And then 1 month after the final murder, an anonymous letter arrived at the doorstep of Mario Spezi, a prominent journalist investigating the case. Inside the envelope was a chilling surprise, a photocopy of a police memo that had never been made public. The monster, it seemed, had infiltrated the investigation. Whoever this person was, they had access to classified documents. They were watching the detectives. And now they were watching the press. Spezi had spent years researching the case. He was one of the few voices unafraid to challenge the police narrative. But now even he felt hunted. He published articles accusing the investigators of incompetence or worse, collusion, and the authorities fought back. Instead of focusing on the killer, they turned their attention to Spezi. He was harassed. His sources were interrogated. His phones were tapped. And soon the investigation began to devour itself. Desperate for answers, the police arrested a new suspect, Pietro Pacciani. Pacciani was a rural laborer with a violent past. He had been convicted years earlier for assaulting and raping his wife. He lived near many of the crime scenes. He had a suspicious interest in pornography. And he had a reputation for brutality. He fit the profile, at least superficially. In 1993, Pacciani was formally charged with 7 of the monster murders. The trial was explosive. The press covered every moment. Prosecutors painted him as a sadistic killer with a taste for blood and ritual. But again, the evidence was thin. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no direct witnesses. The .22 Beretta was never found, but the prosecution insisted Pacciani didn't act alone. He was part of a satanic cult that ordered the murders. The mutilations, they argued, were ritualistic, performed to obtain magic objects for black masses. It was sensational, and it worked. In 1994, Pacciani was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But just 2 years later, the verdict was overturned on appeal. A retrial was ordered. Before that retrial could begin, Pacciani died suddenly under strange circumstances. Officially, it was a heart attack. Unofficially, the whispers returned. Was he silenced? If so, by whom? By now, the investigation was beyond recovery. Dozens of suspects had been interrogated. Innocent men had their lives ruined. Journalists had been targeted. Conspiracy theories ran rampant, satanic cults. Masonic lodges organized crime, political cover-ups. And through it all, the monster remained unnamed, uncaught. In the years that followed, the murders stopped, but the obsession didn't. Books were written. Films were produced. The case became a global phenomenon. Authors like Douglas Preston and Mario Spezi would go on to write The Monster of Florence, a best-selling account of the investigation, and their own brush with the paranoia surrounding it. Because the longer the case dragged on, the more it felt like something larger than murder, something systemic, a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of Italian society. Its fear of sexuality, its patriarchal violence, its obsession with conspiracy, and its inability to look truth in the face. Long after the murders had stopped, the fear remained. In Florence, crime scene photos were still whispered about in bar rooms. Parents still warned their children about parking in secluded places. And though no bodies had been found in years, the legacy of the monster lingered like smoke from a fire no one could locate. The police had failed. The courts had failed. And so a new breed of hunter emerged, not detectives, not prosecutors, but writers. And at the forefront was Mario Spezi. Spezi was no ordinary journalist. He had covered crime for La Nazione, a leading Florence newspaper, since the 1970s. From the earliest days of the monster killings, Spezi had asked questions that no one else dared. Why were the investigations so chaotic? Why did every arrest seem to lead nowhere? And most importantly, why did it feel like the real killer was watching from within the walls of the investigation itself? Spezi didn't believe in the Sardinian vendetta theory. He didn't believe in cults, black masses, or occult motivations. He believed in something simpler and far more disturbing. That the killer was someone hiding in plain sight, someone protected. But saying that publicly was dangerous. Spezi published piece after piece, openly criticizing the prosecution's obsession with weak suspects like Francesco Vinci and Pietro Pacciani. His most damning accusation, that the monster might have been linked to members of Florence's elite academics, businessmen, even judges. He didn't point fingers recklessly. He followed the evidence. But in Florence, following evidence had consequences. In the late 1990s, Spezi met American author Douglas Preston, a best-selling thriller writer who had moved to Florence with his family. Preston was fascinated by the case. He teamed up with Spezi, and together they began to work on a book that would do what the police could not: follow the truth wherever it led. They called it The Monster of Florence. and their investigation uncovered something truly chilling. According to their findings, the monster may not have been a single man. Instead, the killings bore the signs of a coordinated effort, a network of men, perhaps exchanging the infamous Beretta pistol over time, each taking turns committing ritualized murders. The mutilations, they argued, weren't satanic. They were trophies, fetishes, proof of male dominance captured through the destruction of female bodies. The theory was explosive not just because of what it said, but because of who it implicated. Their research led them to examine people never seriously considered by police. A doctor here, a judge there. People who had access, influence, and motive, or at the very least something to hide. And just as they were preparing to go public, the backlash began. In 2006, Mario Spezi was arrested. Yes, the journalist who had dedicated his life to investigating the murders was now accused of obstructing justice and complicity in the monster killings. The charge that Spezi had conspired to throw the investigation off track, that he had helped one of the suspects, a pharmacist named Jutari, destroy evidence, that he was part of a web of disinformation. The accusations were absurd. Spezi had never met the pharmacist. There was no physical evidence linking him to any crime. And yet he was jailed, interrogated, denied access to legal counsel for days. Preston was also questioned and warned to leave Italy. He did. But he didn't stay silent. In the United States, Preston went public. He wrote op-eds, spoke on television, and accused the Italian judicial system of persecuting journalists to protect its own failures. The international press picked up the story. Under mounting pressure, Spezi was eventually released, and the charges were quietly dropped. But the message was clear: investigating the monster could make you the monster. It was a warning. Still, the damage was done. The book was published in 2008. The Monster of Florence became a bestseller. It wasn't just a crime story. It was an indictment of police incompetence, judicial paranoia, and a culture of secrecy that seemed more interested in preserving institutional pride than pursuing justice. And perhaps that was the deepest horror of all. Not that the monster had killed, but that the system had allowed him to escape. Over time, more evidence came to light. Some suggested that Pacciani, the man once convicted, may have been guilty after all, but not alone. Others believed he was entirely innocent, framed by a legal system desperate for a conviction. Investigative journalists uncovered files, audio recordings, and classified documents that hinted at a cover-up or at the very least a willful blindness. Theories flourished. Some believed the killer was a voyeur, a man who followed couples, studied their routines, struck only when he was certain he wouldn't be caught. Others thought the monster was a former soldier trained in tactical ambush and field dressing, hence the precision of the mutilations. Still others pointed to Florence's academic elite, a twisted intellectual circle obsessed with esoterica female anatomy and control. The mutilations weren't random, they were surgical, specific organs removed with purpose, cleanly, almost professionally. And yet, no arrests were made. The .22 Beretta was never found. No fingerprints, no DNA, no confession, just 16 lives taken, dozens more ruined, and a lingering spectre that still chills the hills outside Florence. And so, the journalists kept writing. The theories kept spiraling. And the monster, whoever he was, became something more than a man. He became a metaphor, a symbol of the violence that hides behind charm, the misogyny buried beneath tradition, the corruption that lurks in the shadows of institutions, and the danger of letting fear write the narrative when justice can't. The hills of Tuscany are quiet now. Tourists sip Chianti on sunlit terraces. Couples walk hand in hand through olive groves, unaware of the horror that once stalked these roads. Decades have passed since the last confirmed killing, but in Florence, beneath the Renaissance domes and frescoed ceilings, the shadows still linger. Because while the murders stopped, the wound they left behind never did. Italy has always been a land of beauty and contradiction, a place where art and violence exist side by side, often in the same breath. And the Monster of Florence, whoever he was, personified that contradiction. He struck in places designed for intimacy. He turned passion into panic. He mutilated not just bodies, but trust. To this day, his true identity remains unknown. Theories abound. Some believe the monster is dead, a loner who took his secrets to the grave. Others believe he walks among us older, now a face in the crowd, a retired academic, a respected doctor, a former officer. There are even those who believe he was never just one man but many, a conspiracy, a cult, a ritualistic network masked behind society's most respectable faces. But what we do know with certainty is this: the Monster of Florence changed everything. For Italian policing, it was a public reckoning. The case exposed deep flaws in the investigative system: poor coordination, political infighting, a dangerous hunger for scapegoats. Evidence was mishandled. Suspects were paraded before cameras without proof. Prosecutors pursued satanic fantasies, while the real killer or killers walked free. It became a textbook example of how obsession can consume objectivity. For journalists, the case was both a professional calling and a personal risk. Reporters like Mario Spezi paid dearly for refusing to accept the official story. They were surveilled, discredited, even imprisoned, not for crimes, but for asking the wrong questions. And their ordeal became a warning to the next generation: the truth is not always welcome. For the families of the victims, there was never closure. 16 people died, many of them in their teens or early 20s. Their names were overshadowed by the legend, their faces forgotten in the shadow of the monster's myth. No justice, no final word, just photographs, crime scene files, and empty graves. And yet the monster's presence endures not just in Florence but across the world. His crimes inspired novels, films, and endless documentaries. His methods helped shape the modern serial killer profile. Behavioral units in law enforcement still cite his case as a benchmark for understanding sexually motivated killers. He is studied, dissected, mythologized. He is no longer just a killer. He is a symbol of our fear of the unknowable, of what happens when violence wears a civilized face, of the darkness that exists not in the woods, but in the systems meant to protect us. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Monster of Florence is this: we let him go. Whether by incompetence, corruption, or simple denial, the system failed. The monster watched the police chase ghosts. He watched prosecutors conjure conspiracies. He saw journalists punished for telling the truth. And he survived it all. What does that say about us? About justice? About the limits of human understanding? Perhaps the greatest horror isn't the violence. It's that even with all our tools, our forensics, our psychology, our technology, we still lose. We lose to secrecy, to pride, to fear, and sometimes we choose to lose. Because to solve the case would require admitting that the monster was never just out there in the woods. He was inside the walls, inside the offices, inside the very institutions meant to stop him. The case remains open. Technically, files are still reviewed, DNA samples occasionally retested. There's even been talk in whispers of a potential new lead. But most investigators admit privately it's unlikely we'll ever know. The monster's last known murder was in 1985, and still no one has been convicted. So we're left with questions. Who was the Monster of Florence? Why did he kill? Why were the women mutilated with such cruel precision? Why were some victims never even identified publicly? And why, after all this time, is there still no truth? In the end, maybe that's what makes this story so chilling. Not the blood, not the bodies, but the silence. Because in the hills of Florence, the most terrifying sound isn't a scream in the night. It's the quiet that follows. The quiet of a case unresolved. The quiet of a justice system that looked away. The quiet of a country that never healed. And the quiet of a killer still unknown whose story was never fully written. Because we were too afraid to turn the last page.